We're live on the internet. Can you believe it? So we will almost certainly end a little bit, like at some amount of time after 7, because the 60-minute countdown starts when the piano starts. So we may be looking at like 7:15, 7:30 end time. Ben, just give me the thumbs up when we're ready. We're at like 1 till. Stream's on, yeah.
So we're 10 minutes out.
We're 10 minutes out at least. Okay, they just started pulling the car around, so we're looking at least 10 minutes before we actually start. So just stand by. Get comfy as best you can. Would a bar stool fit there? Would that help you at all? The man says no.
So, I don't know if it's just really cheap batteries, but we're already to 2 bars on all the microphones.
I mean, it should last for an hour at least. Let's try and swap them all out. Yeah, we got time. Yeah, are you using the Pro Cell? We're the Amazon Basics. Which one were you using? Apparently, we put the cheap batteries in the microphones, so that is getting replaced. I really don't understand why we keep bad batteries in the wireless case to begin with, but that's not on me. So, Paul's doing great.
Whenever she gets finished with her opening remarks on the one shot, not finished, when she starts to introduce everybody and they start walking on, go live. Because what I don't want is like the tight shot of people like filtering in behind her speaking.
Right.
So like she says, so please,
Right.
I don't know exactly what she said, like, please help me welcome cut to live.
Leighton, can you go ahead and pull out wide on this shot again? I just want to show Ben
So that's what I want. That's a
the
great
wide
frame.
shot.
That's a good frame.
Okay, I just want to show you that that like
No,
the top.
no,
yeah,
where it's at, it's good.
totally.
Yeah.
I just wanted to
Yeah,
show you.
no, that's fine.
Cool. We can go back to before.
Yeah, this is the shot I want. I just did it once. Now I guess he can't. It's fine. We're not going to do that.
I mean, try it. Ooh, that helped. That's golden. They do okay. Our camera lenses have a stabilizer function on them.
Oh my God,
Isn't that awesome?
that's amazing.
I love that for us.
That's incredible.
Can't tell how much of the light is coming from the house or coming from our lamps. Because they nerfed them pretty bad.
What do you mean?
Like they
Too low?
Yeah.
Should have pushed back. You know, I would have yelled at you for push back.
Yep.
Yeah, I think those orange batteries are
I
good for nothing.
I don't comprehend why those are even in the wireless ones.
Yeah. Well, and the first thing that made me really questionable about them is multiple of them were like dented in. Like,
So
that's not good.
so we typically use the at the Putnam Center, we use the Amazon Basics ones, and those are fine, but those also like frequently have dents in them.
Yeah.
So yeah,
I was like,
I suppose
down to-
the exterior manufacturing can be separate from the interior manufacturing.
if they're already at 2 bars within, I mean,
That was
15 minutes, then I would be stressed the whole show.
I'm just gonna ask Sadie why those batteries are even in there. Why do you ask? Well, you see these big tall trusses with lights on them. They had me climb up not once and not even twice, but 3 times to turn the lights down so that they would not blind the principals. Yep. So, yep, that was not my decision. If it were me, I'd be blasting motherfuckers.
When I was standing up there, they were not even noticing.
Yeah, Paul and I were talking about it earlier, and ultimately, the people that are in charge of setting up the staging for the principals are not the people used to public speaking. So people that are used to public speaking are almost certainly used to stage lighting all the time. But whatever. Too late to change it now. I'm not climbing up on that fucking truss again. Try it.
Clayton will do it. I believe in it.
Will you do it? Will you climb up on the truss and adjust the lights for me? You think you're 100 pounds too heavy for it? Okay, fair enough. He said no. I mean, I'll spot you. So we're approaching 10 past 6. Don't know how far off we are from go time. Check it in. We just arrived, so we're looking at about 4 minutes. Just give me the thumbs up and I'll roll video. Are we fine to keep lighting the same for the whole night? I think that's the move. Someone on YouTube said mics are open. Looks like all your knobs all your faders are down. That was just a couple minutes ago.
This is Bob. Bob's a big fan of clubs.
I belong to everything. That's my high school bowling team. I'm the tall one in the middle.
And this is a film about why you should join one and how Bob discovered that the fate of America depends on it.
Harvard professor and award-winning writer Robert Putnam.
You've been described as the poet laureate of civil society.
Robert D. Putnam, for deepening our understanding of community in America.
He made people pay attention to a concept that most people had never paid attention to.
Social capital, social capital, social capital. Social networks have value.
I'd like to call on Professor Robert Putnam, who gave us the concept of social capital.
Number of people who know one another's first name, the number of people who take part in community organizations, the level of trust and reciprocity in the community.
The places that have better government are the places that have a long history of social networks and social capital.
Your chances of dying over the next year are cut in half by joining one group.
Bowling Alone. Where'd you get the title?
I happened to run into a friend who owned a bowling alley, and he said, "Gosh, Bob, you don't know it, but you've stumbled onto the major economic problems facing my industry, because although more Americans are bowling than ever before, bowling is up in America. Bowling in leagues, bowling in teams is off by about 60%. Everything that reflects connections with other people are going down. How many times last year did you go to church? Down. How many times did you go to a dinner party? Down. How many times last year did you go to a club meeting? In barely a couple of decades, half all the civic infrastructure in America had simply vanished. It's equivalent to saying half of all the roads in America just disappeared.
Everyone has a feeling something's happening, but then he's got charts to actually show what's actually happening.
Whatever's happening to people's sense of mutual obligation, to their understanding about the common good, to their willingness to trust their neighbor, is no longer going on because people are bowling alone.
The book Bowling Alone, which you're familiar with by Robert Putnam.
The activity may still be going on, but there's no social capital being built. That decreases the trust we have in one another. How lonely Americans are, how divided.
You know, he may have been onto something.
We have to see loneliness as a threat to our health security and to our overall national security.
We are trying something that hasn't been done before, which is growing and sustaining a multiracial democracy.
Politics and policy ultimately depends on the social health of our country.
Organization, connections with other people is the only way you get big change.
Democracy is a pain in the ass. If it was just easy, no one would have to go to a meeting and it would all just be fair and easy. You should join, your kids should join, and if there's not an organization you want to join, create one.
America doesn't have to be the kind of America that you've lived in your whole life. You could decide to change history.
Good evening. My name is Victoria DiFrancesco Soto, and I am the Dean of the Clinton School of Public Service. And it is, we've got good representation in the house tonight. It is my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the school, of the Kumpuris family, of the Clinton Foundation, of the Clinton Presidential Library, and of AT&T to the latest installment of the Distinguished Kumpuris Lecture Series. I want to give a special note of thanks to the Kumpuris family and to AT&T for making this space of civic engagement possible. I also want to give a special welcome to some of our guests with us tonight, folks who serve our community and give back to us. I know Representative Nicole Clowney is with us, General Clark, and various members of the Clinton administration. Tonight is a treat. I have been looking forward to this night for a very long time, and I have a specific date, March 12th. This is when I received a phone call from a good friend of mine. I don't see you, Janet, but I know you're out there. Janet Walco, who is one of our Dean's Advisory Board members, and she was just walking out of the South by Southwest premiere of Join or Die. And she says to me, Vicki, we're bringing Join or Die to Little Rock. We're bringing it to the Clinton Presidential Center. I said, okay, absolutely. It's about civic engagement. It's about democracy. Let's do it. And then she says, and Vicki, but we have to bring Secretary Clinton and Robert Putnam to have this conversation. Yes, yes, Janet. Yeah, I say yes to Janet for everything. But in my head, I'm going, how am I going to make this happen? How am I literally going to make the stars align? Long story short, they did. And we have with us Pete and Rebecca Davis, these filmmakers who created not just an eye-opening and impactful documentary, but one that really makes us think about how we move forward. And they do that through using the lens of Dr. Robert Putnam's work, whose work is literally about making democracy work. And Dr. Putnam, who's back here, yours was one of the first books that I read when I was a college freshman. And this is really what made me fall in love with political science, what made me fall in love with civic engagement, and really what led me on my path today. With Robert Putnam, we don't just have a brilliant social scientist. We have somebody who creates work that is relatable and that is prescriptive. What do we do about it? And when it comes to the what do we do about it, I can't think of anyone more relevant than Secretary Hillary Clinton. This is a woman who has been on the front lines of making democracy work here at home in Arkansas, across the nation, and across the globe. So we are in store for a very special conversation, a very special evening. And without further ado, I would like to welcome Dr. Jay Barth, Dr. Robert Putnam, Secretary Hillary Clinton, and Dave and Rebecca Davis.
Welcome, everyone. We are thrilled that you are all here. Secretary Clinton, welcome home. And Bob, thank you for Vicki. Also, Vicki and I are both political scientists, and you helped shape her career trajectory. You helped shape my students' lives. I'm a little bit older than she is, and you helped shape my students' lives because I designed whole courses around your concepts, and it's an amazing.
It's great to be here, actually.
Well, thank you. And the reason we're here immediately, of course, are Pete and Rebecca Davis. So welcome to you all. We've got about 600 folks here. I think a lot of them know, Bob, about the concept of social capital. And some of folks have read your work. Some of you have seen the film. But I would love to get us all on the same page. And Bob, if you could just talk a little bit about your basic arguments on the trajectory of your work, and what the data tells us about social capital and where its role in our lives and in democratic life.
Well, thank you for offering me an opportunity to describe my entire life.
In 3 minutes.
Let's begin with the concept social capital. It's so simple that I'm always embarrassed to say it. Social capital simply refers to social networks and to the fact that social networks have value. Your friends and neighbors have value to you. Your connections with other people in the community, or even your connections more distantly, or even your connections to your own family, all of those have value. They have value in two different ways, actually, that are relevant. One is they have value to you, and the title of this film captures one example of that, namely, you will live longer. I've got the data to prove it. You will live longer if you join a group. I mean, the data are that if you, your chances of dying, actually your chances of dying are high. Your chances of dying over the next year are cut in half by joining one group. So that's an example. That's a true fact, actually. And actually, all the facts I'm going to say are true facts. There are, more recently in national politics, there have been false facts that are often described, but I'm talking here about true facts. But also, besides the advantages of social networks to you personally, there are also benefits outside of you to the rest of your community. That is a community in which people are connected with one another. Government works better. The schools work better. There are many, many other examples of what I mean. The economy grows more rapidly. And all of this is true, holding constant all the other things you might think. Well, I think schools are affected by, how much we pay the teachers. Well, that's true. My wife, Rosemary, who's here someplace, is a school teacher, was a school teacher. So I had a vested interest in paying teachers well. But the data say that parental involvement in the schools is a more important factor in how the schools work, the test scores and all that. So let me back up here and just say what I've just said. Social networks have value. They have value to the people for you if you're in the network, and they also have value for other people who are not necessarily in the network. Even if Rosemary and I happen to have lived for many years in a community in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which has a whole lot of social capital in that neighborhood. People are all the time having barbecues and skating parties and so on. Do you know what a skating party is in Arkansas? Well, we have them in Cambridge. We know from the data that all that social capital is protecting our home when we're not there because the crime rate is lower in neighborhoods in which people know one another's first name and connect with and have high social capital. And that's true in our case, even though, and this is now the moment for confession, I actually never go to this picnics and barbecues and stuff. I feel guilty about that. But what I've just finished saying is that social capital can benefit people even who are not themselves in the networks. I mean, it's amazingly powerful. And the more you think about it, and I thought about it a long time, it's hard to get your mind away from the fact that we used to connect with one another in this country. Tocqueville said in the 1830s that was what defined Americans. We were joiners all the time. But basically, what we found in the course of now many years of work is that beginning in the middle 60s, all of those forms of social capital began to decline. And the country consequently our democracy began to decay in that period. Now, an important question is, well, why did this decline begin in the middle 60s? It basically, and here's the answer. I've not revealed this before publicly, but this is a small group, so I can say that. The decline begins the year that I personally first voted. So I personally have brought this on the American society, and I apologize for that. And I've tried to obscure that by talking about other possible factors. Anyway, that's a long answer to your question.
That's a great answer. Thank you. So Secretary Clinton, Bowling Alone comes out when you and President Clinton are in the White House, and I think it's fair to say that it shaped the Clinton administration in a lot of ways. And I would love for you to talk about the ways in which it shaped the policy decisions and the rhetoric and the way in which y'all thought about policymaking during those years.
Well, first, Jay, thanks so much for moderating this panel, although I could personally just listen to Bob, speculate about the influence he's had on social capital here and around the world for the entire time. But his work, as I first discovered it and as Bill did, really seemed to explain some phenomena to us that we were beginning to observe and wonder about. And among those was how people were getting so polarized and divided, as though they had nothing in common with each other, that their political affiliation, their ideology was their whole identity. Other forms of identity claims that made it very difficult to think about a community that was diverse economically, socially, religiously, racially, everything that you hope to strive for in a pluralistic country like ours. It was getting harder and harder.
And I wrote a book called It Takes a Village, in part because I saw that there was a real view taking hold that we weren't all in this together, and raising our own children didn't mean that we had responsibility for any other child, and no sense that literally we all rise or fall together. And going back to Bob's mention of de Tocqueville, that had a big influence on me when I read that in college, and how we were all joiners. We joined associations, we put up barns, we built churches, we were part of civic groups, farmer groups. I mean, we were big joiners in the United States, and that joining, and on the informal basis, like a backyard barbecue in your neighborhood, or on a formal basis that you joined the Kiwanis or the Rotary Club or Girl Scouts or whatever it is you joined. And all of a sudden that was diminishing, and polarization, divisiveness was increasing. And so when Bowling Alone came out, Bill was immediately struck by it and invited Bob to come meet with us at Camp David, where we kind of peppered him with questions, and he explained his research that was quite concerning, because social capital can be either an increasing asset or a diminishing asset. I don't think it stays, constant, but you want it within a certain band. I think it's right to say, if you're going to have the positive effects from it. So for us, it was a kind of a light bulb moment, and we really appreciated his not only writing and his research, but taking the time to try to talk about this concept, explain it to people, and really urge us to think hard about what direction we're heading. And of course, in the last 25 years, it's kind of gone even further downhill, frankly.
Thanks. So Pete and Rebecca, first, congratulations on a truly great film. Really wonderful. The title of your film may feel a little over dramatic, but I think y'all make the clear case that it makes sense. And I would love for y'all to talk a little bit about your pathway to this film, but how some of that previous work kind of convinced you that actually thinking about death on a variety of levels is the right way to think about this concept of the demise of social capital.
Yeah, I mean, it is very much a provocative title, but we feel like it's one that does not go too far, both on the health aspects that Bob mentioned, from our isolation crisis. We were lucky enough to also speak with Surgeon General Vivek Murthy, who's made this a centerpiece of his administration's agenda, but also for the health of our democracy. And over the course of filming, January 6th happened, but we actually started this project well before COVID, well before January 6th, in 2017. So we were working on this project for about 5 years, and we came to it. I was working at the time as a journalist for NBC News and covering national news. And a lot of the stories I was seeing around the country were symptoms of Bob's work. I was covering things like our school shooting crisis, the opioid epidemic, rising suicide numbers of Americans, and knew about Bob's work from my brother, who, for those who haven't seen the film, my brother was a student of Bob Putnam's, so there was a personal connection. So I was hearing about Bob's ideas, when I'd be home for holidays with my family, and then, really seeing these symptoms on the ground of Bob's work, and wanting to not just cover another school shooting, another story of these symptoms of our isolation crisis. And we approached Bob in his last year of teaching, and we said, how do we help get this class out to everyone in the country so everyone can take Bob Putnam's class?
We really believe that the stakes are really high. The original phrase "join or die" is from Ben Franklin, and it was a famous, probably America's first famous political cartoon. And the message Ben Franklin was saying is, if the states don't come together, but more generally at the spirit of, if America doesn't come together, we're going to lose the Revolutionary War. And he was trying to raise the stakes of what he meant by joining. And as we were looking out and seeing, our democracy in real crisis over these past especially in these past few years, but even over the past decades, as Bob has charted. We really, we really believe the stakes are as high now, and everyone is always asking, well, what can I do about this? And we wanted to open the movie with an action item. And the first line of narration of the movie is, "This is a film about why you should join a club and why the fate of America may depend on it," because we wanted right from the start, the whole argument of the movie, not just to be the story of doom and gloom about our isolation crisis, but really centering it on the action item. Everyone is always worried that, they say things after a hard crisis in the news. They always say, well, I don't know if there's anything I can do alone to address this crisis. And unfortunately, the message of the movie is, you're probably right. There's not much you can do alone to address the crisis, but there is a lot you can do together. So we really wanted to bring it down to the first step, which is come together, and not come together in an abstract sing-song way, in a really concrete way, with your neighbors, join up in a specific way every Thursday night for a meeting. And we hope we can kind of get across that exciting opportunity and the stakes of doing it.
Fantastic. So, Secretary Clinton, I'll probably start with you on this, but I'd love to get other folks in. We're commemorating the 30th anniversary of the creation of AmeriCorps at the Clinton Presidential Center this month. And I'd love to get your thoughts on the role of AmeriCorps and national service more generally in strengthening civic engagement and fostering unity and thinking, moving forward, what do we need to do in terms of national service as an instrument for promoting social capital and civic engagement?
Well, I obviously believe that service of some kind is like right there, the sweet spot of social capital. A lot of volunteer organizations, a lot of humanitarian relief associations. There's just so many churches, synagogues, mosques, people who are out there serving are very much building up and expressing social capital. So to formalize that in the National Service Corporation and AmeriCorps, which, as you say, celebrates its 30th anniversary here in Little Rock in just a short while, is a very powerful way of saying there needs to be more opportunities for service, particularly for young people, but not only young people. I just did an interview for my podcast with Wes Moore, the new young African-American governor of Maryland, who is incredibly impressive. And he just passed through the Maryland legislature a year of service for every student graduating from high school in Maryland. And what the state will do is provide a kind of framework and guidance for students who say, I want to work on the environment, I want to work with the elderly, I want to work with kids, I want to work in schools. And they will then help to find a placement for the student, and they will get paid minimum wage during the year that they serve. And then they will get a stipend of $6,000 to use for education or to put a down payment on the house or whatever. And, he was in the military. He led troops in combat in Afghanistan. And he said to me, the relationships I formed in the Army were the most important ones that I've ever had, because we were literally together, depending on each other in life and death situations. He said, obviously, I don't want the young people of Maryland to go to war, but I want them to be part of something bigger than themselves and find a chance to serve. And I also want to just echo what, both Rebecca and Pete said, because if we can't persuade people to do it because it's a way of giving back, it's a way of getting new experiences, try to persuade people it's a way of actually keeping yourself healthier. And think about this. I mean, everything that you've just heard was explained very convincingly by the Surgeon General in a couple of reports that he's issued, that loneliness is one of our biggest crises, that loneliness has physical and mental disadvantages to any person. And the opioid epidemic, I think, has been rightly characterized as deaths of despair. And you think about what's happening, how people are lonely, how people are isolated, and of course that's amplified now because of screens and social media and the way people spend so much time alone looking not at another person, but at a screen, a facsimile of another person, a facsimile of a relationship. And it's having, as the Surgeon General has pointed out, very real impacts, particularly on young people. A rise in anxiety, a rise in depression, a rise in eating disorders, a startling rise in suicide between the ages of 10 and 14, and an even larger rise between 14 and 25. So when you think about what's happening in the real world in our country right now, we do have an epidemic of loneliness, which is the exact opposite of what, Bob and his work is really trying to point us to.
Bob, thoughts on national service?
Yeah, I'd like to add 2 points, amplify 2 points that Secretary Clinton has made. First of all, and the Surgeon Generals make this very clear, often we think of loneliness as a psychological state. That is, you're responsible for your loneliness. And what he's saying, and what I've been saying for a long time, is it's not. It's a social phenomenon. That is, it's not your fault. It's our fault that we've not connected with one another. And so what he's trying to do is to change the conception of loneliness as something that's an individual trait to something that's a collective trait. And I think he's completely right about that. All the evidence says he's right about that. I wanted to say one thing about the about national service, and one that I know that Secretary Clinton and her husband have long felt, and that is, I need to distinguish. Forgive me, this is a little bit of jargon. I promise I try to avoid jargon whenever I can. But there are two different kinds of social connections, social capital. One is your connections to people just like you. The jargon for that is bonding social capital. So my bonding social capital are my connections to other white, male, elderly, Jewish professors. And my bridging social capital are my, the connections. I do have bridging connections to people of a different gender or people of a different race or a different religion or age or whatever. And those connections, or the jargon for that, is bridging social capital. Stick with me for a moment, because I'm right there with you, Bob. This is, I think this is in some sense the crucial feature, the crucial problem facing our country today. So bridging is good. Bonding is good. I mean, if you get sick, the people who bring you chicken soup will be your bonding social capital. But bridging in a modern, diverse society is really crucial. So far, so good, except that bridging social capital is harder to build than bonding social capital. My grandmother knew that. My grandmother used to tell me, birds of a feather flock together. She would have said bridging social capital is harder to build than bonding social capital, but she didn't think I'd understand that, which is why she used the avian metaphor. But so the basic point is, the kind of social capital we most need in America right now, bridging social capital, is the kind that's hardest to build. And don't get me started, because I really think that that's the fundamental challenge facing the whole darn country right now. And I'm talking about this evening's headlines, is that we don't know anybody from the other side, and therefore we assume the worst of them. I don't think that's equally spread on both parties, frankly, but I do think that that's a problem. And now I'm coming back to the question about national service. National service's biggest potential, it seems to me, is not just in encouraging people to volunteer, but to expose them to people unlike them. That's what the military does. That's why and frankly, that's why I'm sorry that the draft is gone, because what the draft, do people here even remember what the draft was? It was where everybody had to serve, and the advantage of that, there are disadvantages, of course, but the advantage of that was you know, if you talk about the canonical foxhole in a World War II movie, there was one blonde Swede from North Dakota, and there was an Italian from Brooklyn, and there was occasionally a black guy from Alabama, and so on. And that metaphor or that image captured the fact that we were all in this together. And we felt like we were all in this together. Now, I'm not in favor of war any more than you or the new governor of Maryland is, but national service has this possibility within it. And we could do more within the program to encourage people not to connect just with their neighbors or people just like them or college students just like them, but to connect with people quite different. That we have national service programs that derive from your work in my home, in the place where my wife and I now live up in rural New Hampshire. And you know, nominally what they're doing is, you know, building trails in the woods, which is great. But what they're really doing is trying to make connections with people not like them. And that is, to use my jargon, bridging social capital, what we most need as a country. Does that make sense?
Makes perfect sense. So I'm going to talk about another type of organization that's pretty central to Join or Die, and that's labor unions. A really big part of the story of this film. And recent weeks have obviously been a really vital moment in the modern American labor movement. And I'd love, Pete and Rebecca, for you to start off reflecting on this moment and its implications for democracy through this lens.
Yeah, so in the film, we were lucky enough to get an interview with the great labor organizer Jane McAlevey, and also spent some time with a group in Chicago, the Chicago Gig Workers, who's organizing right now with rideshare drivers in Chicago. And what Jane speaks to in her interview, and what the rideshare workers, you know, show through the work that they're doing, is that our unions are great places to learn skills of democracy. You learn how to hold a meeting. You learn how to, you know, democratically fight things out, both with your fellow organizers and against the boss. And as she also points out in our film, labor organizing was ways that we learned those skills and then brought them back to our communities. So it's not rare to find labor organizers that then are doing housing organizing, that are then participating in their you know, city hall meetings. And so, you know, as we show in the film, we're at some of the lowest rates of organized labor in our country. And, you know, that we're seeing more activity, you know, really points to an exciting moment for more people to go through this training ground of democratic processes in the workplace. And they're also a great example of bridging social capital, because our jobs bring a lot of different types of people together.
And there are two really interesting aspects of kind of social capital and civic theory that come together in unions. So one that Bob emphasizes a lot is that social networks don't just have value, social networks have power. And they're a way that, you know, the first step to building power to fight for what you deserve, whether it's at City Hall or at the contract negotiation table, it is, you know, you got to come together and you have to have unbreakable solidarity to, you know, be willing to assert your power. What a strike is the result of often years of meetings of people coming together and trusting each other enough to be able to demonstrate the power that they have to get what they need. The other wonderful thing that we discovered partially through the, you know, filming the movie is that one thing Bob taught me, you know, in his class, and we hope we can show through the movie, is that every institution also has a community angle to it. So you think labor unions are just about getting wages and benefits and, you know, having strikes and getting what you need at the negotiating table and being involved in politics. But what labor unions are also is a community group. And they're usually, you know, we hear all these stories all the time through our movie, and seeing in the archival materials stories of labor unions forming labor union baseball teams and labor union bands and having labor temples in cities where they would meet up at lodge meetings, and you know, being the types of people that show up to funerals and drive you to chemo, you know. And usually when you ask people about the most significant part of their labor union story, you know, they're very happy about the wages and benefits they received, but you know, usually what people will say is, you know, I never knew my coworkers that deep, and I never felt as connected as I did when that happened. And they're a tremendous story of social capital, and as my sister said, a tremendous story of, you know, no matter who you vote for, or where you're from, or whatever, if you have the same boss and you're trying to get the same good deal, you got to work together, and it really bridges divides.
That is, you know, this one actually hit me personally too. I was working with my coworkers actually to organize a union over the course of making this film at NBC News. Myself and about 200 other coworkers were organizing their first digital media union there. And I saw firsthand that these were muscles that we also have to learn how to use. It was new to me to have to go to 5 other coworkers and say, hey, how do you feel about going to another meeting after work instead of going home and watching Netflix? You know, and these were, you know, new skills. And I think for all of us as we're kind of trying to pull ourselves out of this lowest moment of social capital, we're going to have to start using those muscles again. And I think a great place to look forward to inspiration is, you know, the history that, you know, Bob pulls out in Bowling Alone, and that in the film we really tried to celebrate with these wonderful archival photos.
I think it's important, Bob, to point out that membership in everything has dropped. Everything. And you were particularly, and in the movie, very dramatically illustrating the way that religious membership has dropped. And it used to be that, you know, a religious organization could very well provide most of the social capital that somebody, you know, might need, both bonding and maybe even bridging, but it would be so real to them. So you've got, for the first time, I think you told me, less than 50% of the people in this country, go ahead and give that statistic.
Well, no, you're there. Less than 50% of Americans now identify with a particular religion. That does not mean they're atheists, but they don't.
Lift that up, yeah.
They, huh?
Could you lift that up a little?
They don't. They once upon a time, everybody thought of themselves. Not everybody, of course, but most Americans thought of themselves as a Methodist or a you know, Catholic, or as a Jew, or whatever the particular religion, or a particular kind of Methodists. Beginning, it was just at the very first part of it, which was in the middle 60s, early 70s. There's a standard question that everybody asks, that has been asked of 1 million people in America over, you know, nearly 100 years. Are you a Catholic or a Protestant or a Jew or what? And some people say, none, I'm a nun. And they came to be called the nuns, not N-U-N-S, but the N-O-N-E-S. And at the beginning, in the 50s and 60s, about 4 or 5% of Americans were, in that sense, nuns. But then, beginning especially with young people, and I'm going to be quoting the numbers from memory, but this is certainly approximately right. By now, well more than half of all young people are nuns. That's an astonishing, I don't know how, that's an amazing fact that among the youngest generations, it's now odd to have some religious affiliation. I mean, it's unusual to have some affiliation. It's hard to believe that that's true. Now, you know, it's a little less true of people who are a little further along, and I'm a lot further along than you are, and so of my generation, there are not many nuns left. Actually, it turns out as you get older, really old, people's connection religion tends to rise. I think nearer my God to thee is the right explanation for that. But so the overall figure in America, I don't think is yet 50%, but it's going there because it turns out that those of us, people who have a religion, who are not a nun, are gradually disappearing from the population. That's what's driving us inevitably toward this. And can I just take the moment to say, I completely agree with you. Actually, the more we've looked at this, we've come to think that a crucial part of building a unified America is a moral sense that we have responsibility for one another. And 125 years ago, that began in a movement called the social gospel movement. And I don't want to give you the whole history of this, but the main thing that I want to say is that's where a movement to rebuild America will come from. Not just churches. I don't mean just churches, but will come from a kind of a moral reawakening. I'm not a preacher. I don't even pretend to be one. But on this, I can become a preacher. If we don't begin to worry more about other people, we're doomed as a country. I really mean that. I'm not saying you should go out to church, but I am saying we've got to start paying more attention to our obligations to other people. Sorry.
Well done.
Preach.
Indeed. Secretary Clinton, you and Chelsea last week at the Clinton Global Initiative both announced a new core focus for CGI around full equality and equity for all girls and women. And I'd love for you to think about that commitment, your work in that area here and at home and around the globe through this lens of some of the special challenges facing girls and women in terms of this work of coming together, but some of the kind of core needs for that to be part of that picture of equity and equality.
Let me start by talking about at least my views of what is happening with children right now, and then more specifically girls. But you know, I couldn't agree with Bob more that at root, this truly is a moral concern. You know, do we care about one another? And do we care about the most vulnerable among us? And, you know, obviously the elderly, the vulnerable with disabilities, but in particular our children. And we are conducting a very dramatic, and I argue dangerous experiment on raising our children. We are turning over a lot of the raising of our children to screens, and it's different than it was with TV. You know, with TV, you still had a much more active involvement in the outside world. As you know, kids growing up in the 50s, the 60s, even the 70s. But with screens, there is evidence that literally the screens are changing the way the brain develops. And the screens are often substituting for the kind of relationship building that babies, toddlers, children need from the other people, particularly the adults in their life. I mean, one of the saddest things that I think we all see out in the world today are adults with little children, and they're not looking at the children. They're not talking to the children. They're not playing with the children. They're looking at their screens. And there's now increasing evidence that children don't learn on these screens, despite what the commercial might tell you about creating little Einsteins or whatever. They're not learning the way they learn when they're in relationship with somebody who's reading to them, talking to them, playing to them. So we're conducting this big experiment, and we are affecting brain development, and we are affecting the bonds. We are affecting, you know, whether or not children feel safe, whether they develop enough of a sense of independence and confidence to be able to go out into the world. And we're creating, as you know, the Surgeon General has found, many more anxious children, depressed children, children who are part of a larger society. And it's not just families. You know, you just can't say, oh, that family. No, it's the point Bob made earlier. It is the larger society, the messages that we are all conveying. So in the absence of a kind of safe, boundaried kind of environment in which children can be free enough to test themselves and to learn from mistakes and the like. It's like the book you wrote about growing up in Port Clinton, Ohio, right? And we are engaged in a very different kind of child rearing. And so children are now in many ways, I think are looking for guidance. They're looking for guideposts. You know, I was saying earlier that I had a conversation with a group of 16-year-old girls a couple of months ago, and I was talking to them about this Surgeon General finding and how they spend too much time on the screen and all the rest of it. And I found it fascinating that, you know, they pushed back and they said, the screen, you know, what happens on that screen, that is our community. That is where we meet up. That is where we learn. I said, yeah, but I mean, it is not face to face. And this one girl looked at me and said, yeah. And when you were growing up, you didn't have to worry about being shot in your school, did you? I said, no, that never crossed my mind, to be honest. And so the society itself sends so many messages that kids absorb. And because the brain is not even fully developed till you're 25, you know, trying to deal with those messages is often very challenging. Specifically about girls, you know, again, in the Surgeon General's report, in this country particularly, you know, girls are much more vulnerable to all of the challenges that come from screen time. As I said, anxiety, depression, you know, eating disorders, feeling, you know, left out, being bullied, being pushed into activities they don't really want to do, but they want to belong. I mean, girls are much more vulnerable. And I asked the Surgeon General when I was talking to him about this, I said, well, what about the boys? He said, well, of course, boys are vulnerable too. But he said, most boys spend most of their time online gaming or doing other activities. So they're actually in a community. They may be gaming with 2 or 3 of their friends. They may be yelling at the computer screen where, you know, their friend is doing something in the game. And I thought that was a fascinating, you know, insight that maybe boys are less impacted, although they still show a lot of these same behaviors and problems, because their experience is more of a community. But I say all this knowing that we don't know. I mean, that's why I say it's a big experiment. We have no idea. And I would just end by saying the American Academy of Pediatrics about 7, 8 years ago issued an advisory saying no child under the age of 2 should have any screen time, period. You need to spend time with that child. You need to interact with that child. No screen time. They've now upped the recommendation, higher up the age level, try to keep screens to a minimum. Don't give young children phones. Don't let kids have phones in school. If they have them, put it in the locker, but don't let that be their, you know, their crutch. They've got to try to bond or bridge. They've got to try to relate. They've got to try to have some kind of connection with other human beings, their peers, their teachers, whoever. So I think this is a very big challenge to us, and it's very hard to get our arms around it, but I think we should be much more focused on it than we are.
So, Bob, I think we know that in an odd way, you know, many of the most pressing and scariest problems in America are caused by some of the more malignant forms of community, this kind of hyper bonding that shows itself in extremist groups and other ways. I mean, how do you square that fact with this call to enhance community?
That issue, I'm remembering an episode that brought that issue home to me very clearly.
Just a little bit.
Shortly after I wrote Bowling Alone, the tragedy of was it the Murrah building in Oklahoma City, where now I've forgotten the name of Timothy McVeigh, right. led a gang and they blew up the building and killed lots of people. It turned out that McVeigh and his gang had cooked up their plot in a bowling alley someplace in Michigan. And a former student of mine wrote in the New York Times about me. We all would have been better off if Tim McVeigh had gone bowling alone. And that captured this, at least for me, captured this problem of not all connections are good. They don't all have good consequences. That's easy enough to say. The question is, what is it about these malevolent, and it's not just, I mean, there are other, the Ku Klux Klan is another example of it's certainly a group, and they do horrible things. And they even represent the Ku Klux Klan. I've just finished reading a book about the second Ku Klux Klan, not the one in the 19th century, but the one in the 1920s. Pardon? Fear in the Heartland. Thank you for that reference to a great book, actually, especially in Indiana. And in fact, people were seeking a kind of synthetic community. So we can't so sharply distinguish between these two things. I think we have to, of course, you have to, just saying social capital doesn't mean you can forget about making moral judgments. But more than that, I do think it goes back to ridging and bonding, that you're more likely to end up with one of these malevolent forms of social capital if those groups are themselves internally homogeneous. And for goodness sakes, we're seeing that. Well, I would even say we're seeing that. I was about to say we're seeing that in Eastern Europe now with a lot of these far right-wing groups that are, they're social capital, but they're very much focused on distinguishing themselves from everybody else. And I was starting to say that, and then realized, wait a minute, that's true here. It's exactly true here. The whole rise of white nationalism and the murders that are going on in our country right now, political murders that are going on in our country right now, is born out of these, it is social capital, but this extreme bonding and fear of the other. I don't have any good solution to that. I wish I did, honestly. Well, bridging social capital is part of my solution. Yeah, I'm stumbling to an end because I don't have any. It's certainly the case that there can be bad social capital.
Could I,
what we do about it is
two things to add to that. One, while we were researching the film, we really wanted to look into that. And so we looked into the classic example of the worst club in American history, the Ku Klux Klan. And we found this tremendously inspiring story that is a lesson, which is that in many cities where the Klan was, the second Klan, the one at the turn of the century, was gaining in power, there were groups, it started in Oklahoma, there was a group that was an official anti-Klan group. And there are ads in local newspapers that we found, we didn't end up getting it into the film in the end, but of people that say, come to our meeting Thursday night, we are really concerned there's a bad club in town and we're gonna start a good club that's gonna be about driving them out of town and standing with our neighbors. And so it's a lesson that they're, on the flip side of all bad clubs, the answer is us coming together to fight for the light in each of our towns. And you see that in so many examples when, horrible bigotry happens in a town. That's often a time that spurs people to come together. And we need a kind of fight coming together with coming together. That's one answer. A lot of things we've been asked also in the film is, well, okay, you're making this general call to join. Joining is always good. Why are you saying that if some joining is bad and some joining is good? Isn't it a wash? What we've come to believe in kind of promoting this is that a general rising and joining actually will, in the end, And I think, Bob, you'll agree, I'd love to hear both you and Secretary Clinton's thoughts on this. Like, a general rising in joining actually eventually leads to more good joining because one, we know that, everyone is looking for purpose and belonging. And if no one is in town to give you purpose and belonging in a normal, good way, as a normal Rotary Club, as a normal Kiwanis Club, as a normal, bowling league, if the only thing in town to give you purpose and belonging is an extremist group or someone online, you're going to be that because people are so desperate. They're in a desert of wanting meaning and purpose and belonging so badly that they'll throw away their morals for it. And so a general thing when you got 17 options in town and someone comes knocking on your door and says, want to come join our creepy thing? And I'm already a Kiwanis member. It's okay. That we need to get to them first. And then the second thing I learned from Bob is that what we call being a good person is actually concretely just the skills of knowing how to work together. We become pro-social people. We learn about difference. We learn about, hard things. We learn about patience. We learn about different stories of, people living their lives. We learn about how to understand each other by being in groups. And so if you have more of these experiences like national service or, some group that got to you when you were a kid or going to summer camp where you met people different than you, that is inoculation against those types of extremist, malignant groups too.
Secretary Clinton. So while this movie certainly has its bleak moments, and I think our conversation tonight has had its bleak moments, it's a pretty hopeful film, especially the closing section is particularly hopeful. And first, we've done this before. We've begun to rebuild social capital in America. It wasn't always as bright as it was in the post World War II era. And we can rebuild. And y'all do follow 6 different, mostly smaller scale groups that are really thriving. And so let's talk about where all of you see hopeful signs for our ability to join and live. And I'll let anyone pop in on the things that you see going on that really do give you some hope that we can get this thing back on track and begin an upward trajectory in these data lines that Bob has shown us over time.
I don't want to exhaust. I mean, I'll start off. Thanks. I'll start off. I'm not as used to a microphone as some people. So I just want to say one part of the answer to that, and I am hopeful actually. Sorry, can I interrupt to make a distinction that I find useful? It comes from a brilliant rabbi, the former, he's now sadly deceased, but the former chief rabbi of Britain. Alzheimer's strikes. Help. Jonathan Sachs. That's my mind over there. That's Jonathan Sachs. Jonathan distinguished between hope and optimism. And I find it useful. Optimism, he said, is a passive virtue. You're standing there as an observer and you're saying, is the line going up or down? And optimistic means you think it's going up, but you're distinct from it. Hope, he said, is an active virtue. Hope says, I can see how it could go in the right direction, and I'm going to do all that I can to make it go in that direction. So now to come back, I see some signs that make me optimistic, but even more make me hopeful. And by now you all know I really want to change America, and I'm in that sense I think all of us should be engaged in that task. So I think there are signs. Previously, when we've turned a corner as a country, we've turned a corner. It's young people who've led the way. It's old people like me are often able to see the problem because we've been, I know that there was once a time when you did trust your neighbors. You didn't lock your doors. I personally know that. So old people have that ability to say it doesn't have to be this way. But old people are not the ones who are going to build for the future. I'm not the right person to figure out where America should go. But in the past, young people occasionally have done this task. And I think and I'm hopeful that that's coming right now among young people, not just in America. I mean, Greta Thunberg. Raise your hand if you know who Greta Thunberg is. You recognize that name, right? The Swedish was originally a high school kid who's leading the global fight against global warming. That's what it will look like if we're on the verge of turning this around. Or this fellow, again, won't remember his name, but after the shooting in Florida, started a national movement of youth against gun violence, and he's still at it now. I've just been talking. Pardon? David Hogg. Yes, thank you. So I don't say for sure that it's going to happen that way, but I'm hopeful. That's what it will look like if we start moving in the right direction. That's at least one sign of hope.
Indeed.
You know, I think that's I think that is hopeful. I think that is certainly the way most movements started. You know, if you look at the great social movements of our country's history, young people, marginalized people were very often in the lead. Martin Luther King Jr. was a very young preacher when he started. And so I do think that there's a growing sense among a lot of young people that evidence itself in more voting. You know, the voting numbers have gone up in 2018, 2020, 2022. I think there's a greater awareness by many young people that they are going to have to, you know, be more engaged and join. You mentioned, you know, both climate groups and anti-gun violence groups. So I think that that is very hopeful. But I also think that the rest of us who may not lead it need to validate that and need to support that, you know, in person, online. You know, I was invited by Vicki to speak to the advisory board for the Clinton School, and I was, you know, very pleased to talk about the future of the Clinton School, training, you know, young people to have an understanding of public service, to go into public service. And so we were talking about that, and I was thinking about, I'm teaching now at Columbia University, a very large course. I'm co-teaching it. And, you know, the students, they're anxious to, you know, figure out how they can make a contribution to solving the problems. And not in a, you know, tilting at windmills way, but in trying to get the skills and the support to organize to be able to do that. So I am hopeful, although I do love the great phrase of my late friend and predecessor as Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, because she would be in conversations like this, and, you know, people would be a little bit down in the audience, and they would say, "But are you still optimistic?" And she would say, "Well, yes, of course. I am an optimist who worries a lot."
Rebecca, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think, you know, for me, one of the beautiful things of working on this project was getting to celebrate these 6 community groups that we were able to feature in the film. And it was honestly hard to identify those 6 groups, not just because we wanted 6 groups that could let everyone in America see some part of themselves in their group, which was a challenge, but we also wanted to identify groups that weren't explicitly political, red, blue political, Republican, Democrat political. You know, and for me, that had, working in national news, that had been a big part of the lens, you know, that we were putting on the world. And the beautiful thing about spending these past years with Bob's work is he asked us to put a different lens on, this social capital lens. And so to create, you know, these kind of characteristics that we were using as we were trying to narrow down from hundreds of groups across the country as we were researching, is we really wanted to find groups that were based on love of place. And I think that, you know, in the groups we spent time with, you know, I don't think, you know, what was happening in Washington in terms of Republican Democrat fighting was, maybe it came up a little bit, but it was not the predominant part of the conversation. The predominant part of the conversation was what was happening in this place, and the shared thing they were able to come together around was that thing that they loved. And I think, as a journalist, it's been hard, as so many of our local papers that we're so good at celebrating, and our local news sites, these community groups, have struggled in recent years, and there's been kind of more fixation on the national. I think we need more joining over love of place and celebration over love of place. And so that was, where I found a lot of hope in getting to work on this project and be inspired by them.
When I think about this question, Secretary Clinton brings up how young MLK was. And I love this story. I read MLK's memoir, I highly recommend it, of the Montgomery bus boycott. I think it was one of his first books he wrote, and it called Stride Toward Freedom. And he gives this really detailed account of how the Montgomery bus boycott happened. And I'll connect this to the modern times. But what's so funny is the first chapter is, with all due respect to MLK, it's very tedious. And here's why. He lists off all the clubs in Montgomery that he gets acquainted with when he moves to Montgomery for the first time. So it's just a whole chapter right at the beginning before anything gets excited of, I met with my church first, and then I met with all the subcommittees of my church. Then I met with all the other pastors. Then I met with the women's leadership group that was just organized. And there was a human rights council that was just organized of people who cared about racial justice. And we needed a building for something. And the bricklayers union, I met with them, and they gave us a building for something. And then I met with the local NAACP. And then we thought, all the preachers should have another group that is organized together, and I did double duty doing that, all while meeting to discuss phone trees and newsletters and all these different, and presiding over weddings and funerals. And that's the whole first chapter. And then it gets into this exciting things about this epic Montgomery bus boycott. And what the lesson of that is that we only see the end of the story when amazing things happen. We don't see we only see the spark that happens at the end that catches into this great fire, and we're like, Rosa Parks, decided to sit down, and then, everything was changed. All this amazing stuff happened. And what's actually amazing is that there were a bunch of people that were laying tinder for years and years and years in weekly meetings, so that when there was a spark, it would lead to a giant flame. And I love telling this because literally Rosa Parks herself was the secretary, like the position secretary and like president, vice president, secretary in the local NAACP for 10 years before she did that. That's why she was selected to be the person to do this. And I think we should celebrate among young people, not just the big brave moments of, the big protests, though that is very important. We should celebrate all the 10 years of work that goes into laying the tinder. And to connect this to modern days, I think a lot of people our age are discovering and coming to an awareness that we have these ideals and we're really excited to solve these problems for our country, and we desperately need to. But we got to think a little long-term about this. Even though there's not much time, even though there's urgency, we got to put in the day in, day out, week in, week out, Thursday night meeting, email the person and text the person to say, are you coming to the meeting? Doing the Little Dues fundraiser where we raise money and, keeping, doing the organizing of one-to-one conversations that build things one step at a time, and not just be the sitting on the bus, Rosa Parks, but be the 10 years of the secretary of the local NAACP. And I see so many young people doing that, and it's really inspiring.
Wonderful. As I turn it over to my colleague Stephanie Street to close us out, let's all thank Professor Robert Putnam, Secretary Hillary Clinton, and Rebecca and Pete Davis.
What a fascinating and really timely, important conversation. This was really inspiring tonight. So again, and thanks to you, Jay, for being such a terrific moderator. And again, let me thank my colleague as well, Dr. Vicki Soto, the Dean of the Clinton School. And finally, let me once again thank the Kumpuris family and AT&T for really making this program tonight possible, but all of the Kumpuris distinguished lectures we've had over the years. I think we're up to like 43 of them now, and it's been such a tremendous gift to our community. And let me also offer a special word of thanks to our Clinton Presidential Center members. Their support is really vital for us to continue these types of programs, our special exhibition. So we also really appreciate all that you do for us. And I hope all of you will continue to join us for these types of programs. You can find our full calendar of our events at clintonpresidentialcenter.org/events. So I hope you all have a wonderful evening, and thank you again for a very special evening.